Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to dive into a new topic.
This one is pretty fascinating, I think. Today we're looking at a historical workers' movement in Scotland.
And its connections to disability rights in America today.
Yeah, you heard that right, Scotland and America. So we're going to be exploring an opinion piece.
From a blog called The Outside.
Written by Jaime Hoerricks.
Who has a PhD and is actually a descendant of someone involved in this movement we're talking about.
Wow, okay, so that's a direct link.
Called Red Clydeside.
Red Clydeside.
All right.
So maybe we should start with, what exactly is Red Clydeside?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I'm honestly drawing a blank here. What is that, and how does it even connect to disability rights?
Well, Red Clydeside refers to a period in the early 20th century.
Okay.
Specifically in Glasgow, Scotland.
Yeah, about it.
And so picture this bustling shipyards, the heart of industrial Scotland, right?
Picture it, yeah.
But also a place where workers are facing some really harsh conditions.
During World War I.
Especially during World War I.
Yeah.
There was growing inequality at the time.
Makes sense.
And so many workers turned to socialist and Marxist ideas.
Okay, so that's the setting.
Looking for solutions.
Yeah. But how does Marxism tie into disability rights? That's the part I'm not quite getting.
Well, the author argues that to really understand the social theory of disability, you kind of have to look at it through a Marxist lens.
Okay, so it's not just about individual limitations, but more about society as a whole and how that creates barriers.
Exactly. It's about how these societal structures and power dynamics really impact the lives of disabled people.
So Marx saw capitalism as inherently exploitative.
Yeah, prioritizing profit over people.
And the author is saying that's the same way disabled people are often treated within that system.
Right. They're marginalized and disadvantaged by the system.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection now.
So, for example, in Das Kapital, Marx talks about how factory work was so fast-paced that it often led to injuries for the workers. So it illustrates how a worker's value was tied to their physical ability to, keep up with the system.
So the system was basically creating disabilities instead of accommodating people.
Precisely. And the author argues that this same dynamic is still at play today in American capitalism.
Okay.
Like the way it approaches disability.
Yeah.
They're pretty skeptical of the idea that the free market will just somehow provide solutions.
See, I guess that's kind of a bold statement to me, because a lot of people do think that innovation and competition in the market will ultimately benefit everyone.
Right, including people with disabilities.
Yeah.
The author acknowledges that viewpoint.
Okay.
They even talk about a conversation they had with a friend who they call their American capitalist friend. But to counter that more optimistic perspective, they bring up some historical examples that challenge the idea that the American system has always worked in favor of, the most vulnerable.
Interesting examples.
One that they bring up is Shays' Rebellion.
Oh, wait, now remind me, what was Shays' Rebellion again? It sounds familiar, but...
It was this revolt led by farmers
Oh, right.
in the late 1700s.
Okay.
And they were burdened with debt and taxes and felt like the system was rigged against them.
While the wealthy elite held all the power.
Exactly.
So is the author drawing a parallel there, saying that's kind of like what disabled people are experiencing today?
That's exactly it.
Gotcha.
They're arguing that this is a pattern throughout American history,
Okay.
that certain groups are systematically disadvantaged by the way power and resources are distributed.
So it's not just a modern issue. It's like this thing that keeps repeating.
Yes. And they connect this to another historical event.
Okay.
Luther Martin's objections to the Constitutional Convention.
Okay. I vaguely remember this. What was it again?
So basically, Martin was arguing that the proposed Constitution would ultimately put too much power in the hands of just a select few.
Right.
And that could be detrimental to the common good.
So he was worried about the system being controlled by elites.
Yes. Potentially leaving marginalized groups behind.
Right. From the very beginning, there were these concerns.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like a theme throughout American history.
Okay, so we've got this critique of American capitalism.
Yeah.
But what about Marxism itself?
Right, because the author acknowledges that Marxist regimes haven't exactly been utopias either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they argue that neither system Marxism nor capitalism has really ever been successfully implemented, according to their ideals.
Interesting.
But they do make this pretty bold claim.
What's that?
They say that America today operates more like an oligarchy than a true democracy.
Oligarchy, meaning?
No, where a small group of people hold most of the power.
Right. Right.
And they draw a parallel between how dissent was suppressed during Red Clydeside.
Like how...
Well, they used tools like the Defense of the Realm Act.
Okay.
And they compare that to the Patriot Act today and the influence of big tech companies.
So they're saying that even in a democracy, there are ways to silence dissenting voices.
Yes. And control information.
Which is pretty unsettling when you think about it.
Exactly.
It raises questions about who really has the power and how that impacts those who are already marginalized.
Yeah, it really makes you think. So with all this historical context and critique, where does the author go from here?
Well, they propose a really interesting thought experiment.
Oh, I like thought experiments laid on me.
What if we took those Marxist ideals of collective action and applied them to creating a self-sustaining community for disabled people?
Here in America.
Right here in America.
Like a real utopia.
Oh.
Where would this even be?
The author pictures it on unused federal land in Los Angeles County.
Okay.
And they actually have a personal connection to this land and have been trying to implement some sustainable solutions there.
Really? So tell me about this utopian vision.
So they imagine a community that's powered by all local resources, biomass, wind, solar energy, even a closed aquifer for water.
Wow.
And they even propose using super adobe construction, feeling earthquake safe, and made from earth and biomass.
It sounds amazing, almost too good to be true.
Well, that's where the author runs into some issues.
What kind of issues?
They hit a wall of regulations and powerful interests
Okay.
that seem determined to maintain the status quo.
So it's like American freedom, but not really.
Exactly.
Bad.
Like every time they try to challenge the system, they hit a roadblock.
Give me some specifics. What kind of roadblocks?
Well, for one, the area has tons of biomass, which could be converted to fuel, but state and federal regulations make it so expensive to set up a conversion plant.
So only big corporations can do it.
That's the problem. It unintentionally favors big business and stifles any real innovation.
Wow. Okay, so what about wind energy?
Perfect area for wind turbines.
Yeah, California's pretty windy.
Constantly windy.
There's a but.
The feds block it, saying the turbines would mess with military aircraft avionics.
Oh, so military interests trump sustainability.
Pretty much.
And I'm guessing solar power is a no-go too.
You guessed it.
Figures.
They could install solar panels, but regulations limit how much energy they can actually generate independently.
Oh, so they're still stuck relying on the grid?
Partially.
Yeah. Man, it seems like every solution runs into some kind of red tape.
And the irony is they're sitting on top of this massive closed aquifer.
Don't tell me there are water restrictions.
There are. The state imposes pumping restrictions.
Despite the abundance.
Despite the abundance.
Yeah.
It's crazy, especially with all the drought issues in California.
You're kidding me? It's like they're not allowed to be self-sufficient at all.
Well, there's one thing that's allowed.
What's that?
The super adobe construction.
Oh, right.
So building with earth and biomass, perfectly acceptable according to regulations.
At least there's that. So it seems like the author has had a pretty tough time trying to create this community.
Yeah, it's definitely been an uphill battle. Their experiences raise some big questions about freedom and how it's often limited by the system.
Especially when powerful interests are involved.
Exactly.
So how does all of this connect back to Red Clydeside and modern disability rights?
We'll dive more into that in the next part, but I think what the author is trying to show us is that the struggles of those workers back then...
For fair wages, decent housing, basic dignity.
Yeah, all of that really resonates with the challenges that disabled people are up against today.
This is definitely some heavy stuff. It's fascinating, though. I'm starting to see how those connections really come together.
Well, stay tuned, because next time we'll be exploring how the spirit of Red Clydeside can inform activism and advocacy.
For a more just and equitable world for people with disabilities. I'm definitely interested to hear more about that.
It's going to be good.
All right, we'll see you then.
See you next time.
Welcome back. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around everything we talked about in the last part.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It really is. It's amazing to see how something like a workers' movement from over 100 years ago in Scotland
Can have so much relevance today.
to disability rights in America.
Yeah, it shows how these seemingly totally different events and ideas can actually be connected in some really surprising ways.
Totally. We talked about the author's view on capitalism and those obstacles they faced when trying to create that self-sustaining community.
Right.
But I'm still curious how this all directly relates to the lives of people with disabilities.
That's a great question. The author gets into this by talking about the commodification of disability under capitalism.
The commodification. Okay, no, break that down for me because I'm not sure I follow.
So think about it like this. Imagine a system where your worth as a person is constantly being judged by your ability to produce.
To like conform to these standards of ability and productivity.
Exactly.
So it's like you're just a cog in a machine.
Yeah.
Only valuable for what you can contribute to the bottom line.
Exactly. And for people with disabilities, that can mean facing this constant pressure to fit into a system that wasn't designed for them.
We talked about that example from Das Kapital.
Right, where Marx described those factory workers risking injury to keep up with the pace.
Is that what you're getting at here?
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
The system is often creating or exacerbating disabilities because it prioritizes profit over well-being.
And it's not just physical injuries either.
No, absolutely.
It's like the mental health toll of constantly being told you're only as good as what you produce.
Right. It's like living in a pressure cooker.
For anyone who doesn't fit into those neat little boxes of able-bodied and productive.
Exactly. And this pressure can lead to what the author calls the medicalization of disability.
Okay.
So you have things like diagnoses like autism.
Which are often seen as inherent traits.
Right. But they can also be viewed as ways to categorize and control people.
It's like creating a problem that needs to be fixed or managed.
Yeah. And then the question becomes, who gets to decide what's normal or desirable?
Exactly. That's a really good point. And it goes back to that social theory of disability that we talked about before.
It challenges us to look beyond just individual impairments.
And consider how society itself creates barriers.
For certain groups, exactly.
So instead of disability being seen as like an individual tragedy.
It's a social and political issue.
And that connects back to the author's struggle trying to create that self-sustaining community. They were constantly running into those regulations and power structures that just reinforce the way things are.
Like that example with the biomass conversion plant.
Where they were basically blocked by regulations that only benefit big corporations.
Yeah, it shows how the system can actually make inequality worse.
Yeah.
Even when maybe the intentions were good.
It's like the playing field is tilted in favor of those who are already privileged.
And leaving marginalized communities at a disadvantage.
Yeah. So if we're connecting this to Red Clydeside,
Mm-hmm.
are you saying those workers who fought for better conditions,
Yeah.
they were facing similar barriers to what disabled people are up against today?
I think so. I think both groups are fighting against systems that just don't prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable.
This is giving me a lot to think about. So what can we learn from Red Clydeside that could help with the fight for disability rights today?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is the power of collective action.
Okay.
The workers in Red Clydeside, they didn't achieve anything by working alone. They organized, they formed unions, they went on strike.
Strength in number.
Exactly. And that principle is super relevant for disability activism today.
So it's about building those coalitions,
Yeah.
working together to challenge those discriminatory policies.
It's not just individuals fighting for their own rights, but a collective movement pushing for a more inclusive world for everyone.
And another key lesson from Red Clydeside
What's that?
is about challenging the way things are.
Yeah.
They weren't content with just like asking for small favors,
No, they wanted a fundamental shift in power.
where workers had a real voice.
Yeah, and a share in the wealth they were creating.
So we can't just settle for making the system a little bit more accommodating.
Right. We need to be willing to imagine something totally different.
And fight for a truly just and equitable society.
Exactly.
You know, that vision of a self-sustaining community that the author had, even though it was met with so many roadblocks.
Yeah.
It's a good example of that. It's about envisioning a different way of living.
And organizing society.
One that values all people.
And prioritizes their needs.
This is really inspiring, but it also feels kind of overwhelming. Like, where do we even start? How do we take these lessons from Red Clydeside and turn them into action?
That's a great question. And it's actually the perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive.
Oh, perfect.
Where we're going to explore some specific examples of activism and advocacy
Both historical and contemporary.
that really embodied the spirit of Red Clydeside and can offer a roadmap for making real change.
All right, so we're back and ready to really dig into how we can put these lessons from Red Clydeside into action.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about theory and history, but now it's time to get practical.
Exactly. What can we actually do to make a difference in the fight for disability rights today?
Well, one of the things that made Red Clydeside so impactful was their ability to disrupt the status quo.
Like the strikes and protests.
Exactly. They were making it impossible for those empowered to ignore them.
So how do we do that today? It's not like we can shut down shipyards or anything.
True. But think about things like social media campaigns or boycotts.
Or even direct action targeting companies that have harmful practices.
That's the point. You got to make it more costly for them to ignore us.
So apply pressure strategically.
Right. And it doesn't always have to be huge, dramatic gestures either.
What do you mean?
Disruption can happen in everyday moments, too.
Oh, okay, like what?
Calling out ableist language, educating friends and family, or just refusing to conform to expectations that don't serve you.
So it's those little acts of resistance.
That can slowly chip away at the status quo.
It's about changing the narrative around disability.
Exactly. And challenging those assumptions about worth and productivity that we talked about before.
Right, like dismantling those ideas is a form of disruption in itself.
Definitely. And don't forget about the importance of solidarity.
Like those workers in Red Clydeside, they knew they were stronger together.
Yeah. And that's true for the disability community today, too.
We've got this shared goal of accessibility, inclusion, justice.
And those goals become even stronger when we team up with other groups who are fighting for similar things.
Right, because our struggles are all connected in a way.
Exactly.
The rising tide lifts all boats.
And the author's experience trying to build that community you talked about really shows how important it is to engage with the political process.
Because they ran into all that red tape and those powerful interests that just wanted to protect the way things are.
Right. It shows how we need to work to change the policies that impact our lives.
So vote advocate for legislation that supports disability rights. Hold those elected officials accountable.
Exactly. And support organizations that are actually working to make things better.
The people and groups that are on the ground fighting for change.
Yeah, because real change has to happen on a systemic level.
And we can't forget about self-advocacy, too.
That's huge.
Each of us has to be willing to speak up for ourselves.
To demand our rights and educate others.
It can feel daunting sometimes.
Especially when you're up against so much discrimination.
But finding your voice and using it is powerful.
And it can inspire others to do the same.
You know, the author asked that question at the end of their post.
By joining a community like the one they envisioned.
Yeah. Would you join a community built on sustainability, solidarity, and meeting everyone's needs?
It makes you think about what kind of world we want to live in.
A world where basic needs are rights, not commodities.
And how are we going to make that happen?
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you that same question. What's your contribution going to be? How are you going to carry that spirit of Red Clydeside forward?
What actions will you take to create the world you want to see?
The world we all deserve.
The spirit of Red Clydeside is calling.
Will you answer?
I hope so. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then.